Welcome to History Teller YT. Today, we journey back more than 3,000 years to a city that stood at the crossroads of myth and reality. A city whose fall marked the end of an age and gave birth to one of the greatest stories ever told. Troy. You may know it from Homer's epics, from Achilles and Hector, from a Trojan horse. But behind the poetry lies something deeper. A real city buried beneath layers of earth. A real world collapsing under war, trade rivalries, earthquakes, and human pride. In this complete historical journey, we explore Troy through archaeology, ancient texts, and modern scholarship. We follow the rise of the Bronze Age world, the power of Mycenaean kings, the strategic importance of Troy, and the evidence hidden beneath the soil of Hizarlik. We examined how myth preserves memory, how history fades into story, and why the siege of Troy still matters today. This is not just the story of a war. It is the story of how civilizations fall, how humans remember disaster, and how truth survives even when facts are lost. Stay with us, because once you understand Troy, you will never look at history the same way again. When people hear the name Troy, they often imagine a city born entirely from poetry, shaped by gods, heroes, and dramatic speeches. For centuries, Troy existed more vividly in literature than in maps. Homer's Iliad placed the city at the center of a world ruled by honor, fate, and divine interference, but offered few clear geographical details that historians could verify. Ancient Greek audiences did not require precision in location. They already believed Troy was real. The story's power mattered more than coordinates. Yet geography matters deeply when myth collides with history. Troy was said to sit near the Hellespont, the narrow waterway connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. This location alone would have made Troy extraordinarily important in the late Bronze Age. Any city controlling that passage could influence trade routes linking Anatolia, the Aegean, and the wider Near Eastern world. Grain, metals, timber, and luxury goods all moved through this corridor. A fortified city, there would be wealthy, contested, and strategically vital. Ancient writers beyond Homer supported this placement. Herodotus, Strabo, and later Roman authors all described Troy as being in northwestern Anatolia, near modern-day Turkey. They treated the city not as legend, but as ancestral memory. Roman emperors even traced their lineage to Trojan heroes, especially Aeneas, reinforcing Troy's perceived historical reality. This belief shaped political identity for centuries. Still, belief is not proof. For modern historians, the challenge was separating poetic tradition from physical evidence. Homer wrote down his epics centuries after the supposed war, drawing from oral traditions that evolved over time. Battles grew larger, heroes became grander, and divine involvement intensified. The question was not whether Homer invented Troy, but whether the story preserved a distorted memory of real events. Geography suggested possibility, but only archaeology could test it. The modern quest for Troy began not with universities or governments, but with obsession. Heinrich Schliemann was not a trained archaeologist. He was a wealthy businessman who believed, with almost religious conviction, that Homer's epics described real places and real events. At a time when many scholars dismissed the Trojan War as pure myth, Schliemann treated the Iliad as a historical guidebook. In the 1870s, Schliemann began excavations at a site called Hizarlik in modern Turkey. Local tradition had long associated this mound with ancient Troy, but no systematic excavation had proven it. Schliemann was convinced he had found the right place, and he dug aggressively. Too aggressively. He used large trenches, removed entire layers of soil, and destroyed valuable archaeological context in his rush to reach what he believed was Homer's Troy. What he found shocked the academic world. Beneath the mound were not one city, but many. Layer upon layer of settlements built, destroyed, and rebuilt over thousands of years. This alone proved that Hizarlik had been an important site for a very long time. Schliemann believed he had found King Priam's Troy and even claimed to discover Priam's treasure, a collection of gold objects he dramatically smuggled out of the Ottoman Empire. Later scholars corrected many of his conclusions. The layer Schliemann identified was far older than the traditional date of the Trojan War. His methods caused irreversible damage. Yet despite his flaws, Schliemann changed history. He proved that Troy was not imaginary. It was a real place with real walls, real destruction layers, and a long urban life. Myth had a physical anchor. Schliemann's work forced historians to take Homer seriously, not as literal history, but as a source rooted in memory. The question shifted. Instead of asking whether Troy existed, scholars began asking which Troy might be Homer's Troy, and what kind of conflict could have inspired the epic tradition. Homer's Iliad is not a history book, but it is not pure fantasy either. It reflects a world that feels authentic in its social values, warfare practices, and political relationships. Kings rule small territories, alliances are personal, and honor governs behavior. This fits well with what archaeologists know about the late Bronze Age Aegean world, especially Mycenaean Greece. The warriors in the Iliad fight with bronze weapons, use chariots in limited ways, and value personal glory over centralized command. These details align with archaeological evidence rather than later Greek warfare. Even the boar's tusk helmet worn by Odysseus, once thought symbolic, has been found in Mycenaean graves. Such details suggest that the epic preserves genuine memories of an earlier age. However, memory is not accuracy. Oral traditions compress timelines, merge characters, and exaggerate events. A conflict that may have involved trade disputes, regional power struggles, or limited warfare could transform into a 10-year siege involving gods and legendary heroes. Homer was not lying. He was inheriting stories shaped by generations of singers, each adding meaning and drama. From a historical perspective, the Trojan War likely represents not a single event, but a pattern of conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian cities. Troy's location made it a natural rival. Control of trade routes, access to resources, and political dominance would have been worth fighting over. The epic preserves the emotional truth of that rivalry, even if it reshapes the facts. Thus, archaeology and myth are not enemies. Archaeology provides the structure. Myth provides the voice. Together, they allow historians to reconstruct a past that is neither purely factual nor purely fictional, but human. Troy stands at that intersection where memory, poetry, and soil come together. To understand why a conflict like the Trojan War could happen, we must first step into the wider world of the Late Bronze Age, roughly between 1600 and 1200 BCE. This was not a primitive or isolated era. It was a highly interconnected international system linking Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean. Kings exchanged gifts, diplomats traveled long distances, and merchant ships crossed dangerous seas carrying copper, tin, gold, textiles, and luxury goods. Bronze was the foundation of power. Since bronze required both copper and tin was rare, control of trade routes was essential. States that could secure access to these materials gained military and political advantage. This dependence created tension. Cities rose and fell not only by warfare, but by disruption of trade. A city like Troy positioned near critical sea lanes, would have been deeply involved in this economic network. Written evidence from the period confirms this interconnectedness. Clay tablets from Egypt and the Near East, such as the Amarna letters, reveal a world where rulers addressed each other as equals, negotiated marriages, and complained about trade imbalances. These texts mention Western lands that many scholars associate with Mycenaean Greece. While Troy itself is not named clearly in these records, the political environment they describe fits the world Homer indirectly portrays. This international system was fragile. Alliances were temporary, loyalty was personal, and power depended on constant negotiation. A disruption in one region could ripple outward. A conflict over access to a port, the capture of merchant ships, or the shifting loyalty of a local ruler could escalate quickly. In this context, a prolonged conflict near the Hellespont no longer seems impossible or exaggerated. It seems likely. The late Bronze Age was not peaceful stability. It was tense balance, and Troy stood directly within that balance, not on its margins. Across the Aegean Sea, a powerful civilization was taking shape. Mycenaean Greece was not a unified nation, but a collection of palace-centered kingdoms such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes. Each was ruled by a wanax, a king whose authority combined military leadership, religious power, and control of economic resources. These kingdoms competed with one another, but they also shared language, culture, and values. Archaeology reveals a society deeply oriented toward warfare. Massive stone walls, known as Cyclopean fortifications, surrounded Mycenaean citadels. Shaft graves and tholos tombs contained weapons, armor, and symbols of status. Frescoes and artifacts show chariots, spears, shields, and helmets. Warfare was not constant chaos, but it was central to elite identity. The Mycenaean economy was organized through palace administration. Linear B tablets record inventories of weapons, ships, and personnel. These records prove that Mycenaean rulers could mobilize large forces, manage logistics, and plan campaigns. This directly challenges the idea that Homer's armies were purely fictional. While the epic exaggerates numbers and heroism, the administrative capability behind such expeditions was real. Importantly, Mycenaean warfare emphasized raiding and limited campaigns rather than total conquest. Capturing wealth, securing alliances, and demonstrating power mattered more than annihilating enemies. A long siege like Troy's would have been unusual, but not impossible, especially if political and economic stakes were high enough. Homer's heroes reflect this warrior elite. They are not national soldiers, but aristocratic fighters driven by honor, reputation, and loyalty. Their world matches what archaeology reveals. This does not prove the Trojan War happened exactly as told, but confirms that the people capable of fighting such a war truly existed. Troy was not isolated from this world. Archaeological evidence shows that it was a wealthy, fortified city with strong connections to both Anatolia and the Aegean. Its walls were massive, its architecture sophisticated, and its location ideal for controlling maritime traffic. This made Troy both prosperous and vulnerable. From the perspective of the Mycenaeans, Troy may have been a gatekeeper. Ships traveling toward the Black Sea would have passed near its shores. If Troy imposed tolls, restricted access, or favored certain trading partners, conflict could follow. Such disputes would not appear in epic poetry as trade disagreements, but as personal insults, broken oaths, or stolen women. Anatolian records introduce another layer. Hittite texts mention a city called Walusa, which many scholars identify with Troy. These texts describe Walusa as a political entity involved in treaties, rebellions, and diplomatic disputes. At times, Walusa appears aligned with the Hittite Empire, placing it within a major power structure that the Mycenaeans may have challenged. This transforms the Trojan War from a simple Greek versus Trojan story into a complex international conflict. A Mycenaean attack on Troy could have been seen as interference in Anatolian affairs. The war, remembered later as heroic legend, may have been one episode in a larger struggle for influence. Thus, Troy was not just a backdrop for myth. It was a real city embedded in real politics. Its destruction, whether caused by war, earthquake, or both, left a deep impression on regional memory. That memory, shaped by generations of storytellers, eventually became Homer's epic. One of the most important discoveries made at Hazarlik was that Troy was not a single city frozen in time. Instead, it was a sequence of cities, built one on top of another across more than 3,000 years. Archaeologists have identified at least 9 major occupation layers, labeled Troy I through Troy 9, each representing a different phase of settlement, destruction, and rebuilding. This alone changed how historians approached the Trojan War. The question was no longer whether Troy existed, but which Troy might match Homer's account. The earliest layers, Troy 1 and 2, date to the early Bronze Age. These settlements were relatively small, with simple fortifications and limited regional influence. They do not fit the image of the wealthy, powerful city described in the Iliad. Schliemann mistakenly identified Troy II as Homeric Troy, largely because of its impressive remains and the dramatic destruction layer he uncovered. Later research showed this layer was far too early, predating the Mycenaean period by centuries. The focus then shifted to later layers, particularly Troy 6 and Troy 7. Troy 6, dating roughly from 1700 to 1250 BCE, stands out immediately. Its walls were massive, built with carefully cut stone, and sloped outward in a way that made them difficult to assault. Towers and gates suggest advanced military planning. The city within these walls appears prosperous, with large houses and evidence of international trade. This Troy looks like a capital city, not a village. Troy 7 follows directly after Troy 6 and shows signs of stress. Buildings are more crowded, storage jars are buried in floors, and the overall layout suggests preparation for siege or crisis. This layer dates to around the traditional time of the Trojan War. The transition between these layers is one of the most debated issues in Aegean archaeology because it may preserve the physical trace of a remembered conflict. Thus, archaeology does not give us a single Troy to point to. It gives us a sequence of Troys, each with its own story. Somewhere within these layers lies the historical core, if any, of the war Homer immortalized. One of the most difficult questions archaeologists face is determining how Troy was destroyed. Destruction layers can result from many causes: warfare, earthquakes, fires, internal collapse, or even accidental events. At Troy, the evidence is complex and sometimes contradictory, which is why debates continue even today. Troy 6 appears to have been destroyed around 1250 BCE. Initially, many scholars believed this destruction was caused by an earthquake. The city's walls show signs of collapse consistent with seismic activity, and the region is known to be tectonically active. Some buildings seem to have fallen outward rather than inward, which supports this interpretation. If Troy 6 fell to natural disaster, then it cannot be the Troy of Homer's War. However, the story does not end there. Troy VA, the earliest phase of Troy 7, shows clear signs of human violence. Archaeologists have found arrowheads embedded in walls, evidence of fires, and skeletons left unburied in the streets. These are not typical markers of earthquake destruction. They suggest chaos, sudden attack, and possibly massacre. The city seems to have been taken by force. This combination has led many scholars to propose a sequence of events. Troy 6 may have been weakened by an earthquake, reducing its defenses and stability. Shortly afterward, Troy VIA may have been attacked by enemy forces who took advantage of this vulnerability. In such a scenario, memory could merge both events into a single catastrophic fall, remembered later as a Great War. From the perspective of oral tradition, the cause mattered less than the outcome. A proud city fell. Lives were lost. Survivors scattered. Whether walls collapsed from shaking earth or enemy assault, the trauma would be real. Over generations, storytellers could transform a complex sequence into a single heroic narrative. Thus, archaeology does not confirm Homer's story directly, but it does confirm destruction, violence, and collapse at the right place and time. That alone makes the Trojan War historically plausible, even if its details remain uncertain. While destruction captures attention, understanding Troy also requires examining how people lived there before disaster struck. Archaeology reveals Troy as a structured, hierarchical society with economic depth and cultural complexity. This context helps explain why its fall would leave such a lasting impression on regional memory. Excavations show that Troy had access to agricultural land, water sources, and trade routes. Storage facilities suggest surplus production, while imported goods indicate long-distance connections. Pottery styles show influence from both Anatolia and the Aegean, confirming Troy's role as a cultural crossroads. This was not an isolated city, but a participant in international exchange. Social organization within Troy appears stratified. Larger houses near the citadel likely belonged to elites, while smaller dwellings spread outward. Fortifications protected not only the ruling class, but the broader population, implying collective investment in defense. This aligns with Homer's portrayal of Troy as a city fighting for survival, not just a royal household guarding its wealth. Religious life also played a role. Shrines, altars, and symbolic artifacts suggest ritual activity tied to protection, fertility, and divine favor. In times of crisis, such practices would intensify, reinforcing the belief that gods shaped human fate. This belief is central to the Iliad, where divine intervention explains both victory and defeat. When such a city fell, the consequences would ripple outward. Refugees would carry stories to neighboring regions. Traders would speak of ruined walls and dead kings. These accounts would evolve, shaped by fear, pride, and grief. Over time, the memory of Troy's fall would grow larger than life, becoming a symbol of loss and heroism. In this way, archaeology fills in the human background behind the myth. Troy was not just a name in a poem. It was a living city with families, beliefs, and ambitions. Its destruction was not just an event, but an experience powerful enough to echo across centuries. While Greek sources about Troy come mainly from poetry, Anatolia offers something very different: archives. The Hittite Empire, centered in what is now central Turkey, was one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age. Unlike the Mycenaeans, the Hittites left behind thousands of written records on clay tablets. These texts include treaties, diplomatic letters, legal codes, and military reports. They allow historians to observe international politics in real time rather than through mythic memory. The Hittites ruled a vast territory stretching across Anatolia and into northern Syria. Their power depended on managing vassal states, maintaining alliances, and suppressing rebellions. As a result, they documented their relationships carefully. When a city rebelled, switched allegiance, or was attacked by foreign powers, it often appeared in the records. This makes the Hittite archives crucial for understanding whether Troy played a role in regional politics. Several Hittite texts mention a place called Walusa. Linguistically, Walusa closely matches the Greek name Ilios, another name for Troy used in Homeric poetry. This connection is strengthened by references to a nearby land called Tarusa, which resembles the Greek Troia. These similarities are not random. In the late Bronze Age, names often changed pronunciation across languages, especially between Indo-European and Anatolian tongues. Walusa appears in the records as a city of political importance. It was not a minor settlement, but a kingdom with its own ruler. At times, Walusa was a vassal of the Hittite Empire, bound by treaty and protected by Hittite power. This alone changes how we view Troy. It was not an isolated city-state waiting to be attacked by Greeks. It was part of a major imperial system. These texts do not mention Achilles or Hector, but they describe the same kind of political instability and conflict that could later inspire epic storytelling. Through the Hittite records, Troy begins to emerge not as legend, but as a named actor in international history. One of the most important Hittite documents is the treaty between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and a ruler of Walusa named Alexandu. The name Alexandu is striking. Many scholars note its similarity to Alexandros, another name used for Paris in the Iliad. While this does not prove identity, it suggests cultural overlap between the Greek and Anatolian worlds. The treaty itself shows Walusa as politically vulnerable. It needed Hittite protection and pledged loyalty in return. The text refers to earlier conflicts, disputes over succession, and foreign interference. This indicates that Walusa was not always stable and may have been a target for outside powers seeking influence in the region. Another key figure in the Hittite texts is a group called the Ahiwa. Most scholars agree that this term refers to the Mycenaean Greeks. The Hittites describe Ahiwa as a powerful kingdom across the sea, capable of challenging Hittite authority in western Anatolia. At times, the Hittite king treats the ruler of Ahiwa as an equal, suggesting significant power. Several letters describe conflicts involving Ahiwan agents supporting rebellions in Anatolian cities. One letter mentions a war over Walusa that was eventually settled diplomatically. While details are scarce, this is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that a conflict involving Troy and Mycenaean Greeks may have occurred. This war does not resemble Homer's 10-year siege. It appears smaller, political, and controlled by elite negotiation. Yet oral tradition does not preserve diplomatic settlements. It preserves drama. A limited conflict, remembered and retold over centuries, could grow into a grand narrative of total war. What matters most is that the Hittite records independently confirm key elements of the Trojan story. A city corresponding to Troy, Mycenaean involvement and military conflict in the right region and period. Myth and archive, for once, point in the same direction. The gap between Hittite records and Homer's epics is not a gap of truth versus fiction. It is a gap of perspective. The Hittites recorded events as political problems to be managed. Homer preserved them as moral and heroic struggles. Each reflects the needs of its audience. If a Mycenaean force attacked Walusa, the Hittites would describe it as rebellion, interference, or treaty violation. For Greek storytellers, the same event could become a tale of honor, betrayal, and vengeance. Over time, names change, motives simplify, and events merge. The gods enter the story to explain outcomes that human logic cannot. Importantly, oral tradition favors memory over chronology. A war that involved multiple campaigns, pauses and negotiations could be remembered as a single continuous struggle. Heroes from different generations could appear together. The result is not history in the modern sense, but cultural truth. The fall of Walusa, whether caused by war, internal collapse, or shifting imperial power, would have marked the end of an era. The late Bronze Age world soon collapsed entirely, with cities destroyed, trade networks broken, and populations displaced. In such chaos, stories become anchors of identity. They explain who suffered, who fought, and who survived. Troy's story endured because it sat at the intersection of worlds. Greeks remembered it as the greatest war of their past. Anatolians remembered it as a contested city in a dangerous frontier. Archaeology and texts now allow us to see both sides. Thus, the Hittite records do not solve the mystery of the Trojan War. They deepen it. They show us how history becomes memory, and how memory becomes myth. Troy stands not as proof of Homer's accuracy, but as proof that epic poetry can grow from real human conflict. The battles described in Homer's Iliad are dramatic, personal, and often brutal. Heroes fight face to face, exchange insults before striking, and seek individual glory above all else. At first glance, this style of warfare appears unrealistic when compared to organized armies of later history. Yet archaeology suggests that Homer's depiction aligns closely with how warfare actually functioned in the late Bronze Age. Homeric combat centers on elite warriors rather than anonymous soldiers. This reflects a social reality in which warfare was dominated by aristocratic fighters whose status depended on personal reputation. Archaeological finds from Mycenaean graves support this image. High-status burials contain swords, spears, daggers, and armor, while lower-status individuals are rarely buried with weapons. This suggests that combat was indeed the domain of a warrior elite. The Iliad emphasizes single combat within larger battles. While this may seem poetic, it fits a world where leaders inspired troops through personal bravery. Killing an enemy champion could break morale, shift momentum, and bring honor to one's household. Such actions mattered deeply in societies where leadership was personal rather than institutional. Homer also describes chaotic battlefields with shifting alliances, retreats, and sudden advances. There is little sense of rigid formations or centralized command. This matches what we know from Bronze Age warfare, which lacked the discipline and structure of later hoplite or Roman armies. Communication was limited, and command depended on visibility and voice. Thus, while Homer heightens drama, he does not invent a false military world. He preserves a memory of how war felt to those who fought it: close, violent, uncertain, and deeply personal. The poetry exaggerates emotion, not structure. Beneath the verse lies a recognizable pattern of late Bronze Age combat. Homer's descriptions of weapons and armor were long dismissed as symbolic or anachronistic. Modern archaeology has overturned that view. Many items once thought imaginary have been recovered from Bronze Age contexts, confirming that Homer preserved technical details with surprising accuracy. The primary weapon of Homeric warriors is the spear. Heroes often carry two spears, one for throwing and one for close combat. Archaeological evidence supports this practice. Bronze spearheads of various sizes have been found across Greece and Anatolia, indicating both throwing and thrusting use. Spears were practical, versatile, and deadly, making them the backbone of Bronze Age warfare. Swords appear frequently in the Iliad, though usually as secondary weapons. This matches archaeological reality. Bronze swords were expensive and fragile compared to later iron blades. They were effective in close combat, but required skill and maintenance. Many Mycenaean swords show signs of repair, suggesting long-term use by elite warriors. Armor in Homer is die Fersche. He describes bronze helmets, cuirasses, greaves, and shields. The famous boar's tusk helmet worn by Odysseus was once thought mythical, yet examples have been found in Mycenaean contexts. These helmets were constructed from leather and tusk plates, offering protection while remaining lightweight. Shields are described in varying sizes, including large body shields. Archaeological depictions from frescoes and artifacts confirm the use of such shields in the Late Bronze Age. Their decline later helps date the Iliad's military imagery to an earlier period. Taken together, these details show that Homer was not inventing equipment. He was preserving a material culture that had already vanished by his own time. His poetry acts as a bridge between archaeological remains and lived experience. One of the most debated aspects of the Trojan War is the idea of a 10-year siege. From a logistical standpoint, such a prolonged campaign would be extremely difficult for Bronze Age societies. Supplying an army across the sea for a decade seems implausible if imagined as continuous warfare. Archaeology suggests a different model. Bronze Age warfare relied heavily on seasonal campaigning. Armies would raid, withdraw, and return over multiple years. A 10-year war may represent a series of expeditions remembered as a single prolonged struggle. Homer compresses time for narrative clarity, turning repeated raids and standoffs into an epic stalemate. Archaeological evidence from Troy, VA supports this interpretation. Signs of long-term stress suggest preparation for repeated threats rather than a single overwhelming assault. Storage jars, crowded housing, and defensive modifications indicate a city expecting recurring danger. Raiding was a common tactic. Capturing livestock, goods, and prisoners weakened enemies economically and psychologically. Homer's frequent references to raids, spoils, and captive women reflect this reality. The war for Troy may have involved many such actions, punctuated by negotiation and temporary truces. The famous Trojan horse, while likely mythical, may symbolize deception rather than a literal device. Archaeology offers no evidence for such a structure, but deception, betrayal, and internal collapse are common in the fall of fortified cities. Myth turns strategy into symbol. In the end, the warfare of the Iliad is not a fantasy of impossible battles. It is a poetic memory of real conflict shaped by the limits and methods of Bronze Age war. Archaeology does not confirm every detail, but it confirms the world that made such a story possible. In the Iliad, kings are everywhere. Agamemnon, Priam, Menelaus, and others dominate the political landscape, yet their power is far from absolute. Homeric kings do not rule through laws or institutions. They rule through personal authority, wealth, ancestry, and the ability to persuade followers. This vision of leadership once seemed unrealistic, but archaeology and administrative records from the Late Bronze Age confirm that it closely matches historical reality. Mycenaean kings, known as wanaks, presided over palace-centered societies. Linear B tablets reveal that these rulers controlled land, labor, and religious activity, but they depended heavily on local elites and warrior companions. Loyalty was personal and conditional. A king who failed to reward his followers or protect their honor risked rebellion. This tension is central to the Iliad, especially in the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon's authority is constantly challenged. He commands the largest army, yet he must argue, negotiate, and justify his actions. When he dishonors Achilles by taking Briseis, the result is not obedience but withdrawal. This reflects a real social structure where kings were first among equals, not untouchable monarchs. In Troy, Priam's kingship follows a similar pattern. He is respected for age, lineage, and wisdom, but he does not dictate events freely. His sons act independently, and Hector carries the burden of defense more than the king himself. This division of roles mirrors what we see in other Bronze Age societies, where military leadership and ritual authority could overlap but were not identical. Thus, Homer's kings are not fictional exaggerations. They represent a fragile form of authority rooted in personal relationships. Archaeology supports this image, showing societies where power was negotiated daily, not imposed automatically. Homeric heroes are larger than life, but they are not gods. They bleed, suffer, argue, and die. Their greatness lies not in invincibility, but in how fully they embody the values of their society. This makes them valuable historical evidence, because ideals often reveal more about a culture than laws or records. Achilles represents the warrior ideal taken to its extreme. He values honor above life itself. Archaeology shows that elite warriors in the Bronze Age were buried with weapons, armor, and symbols of prestige, indicating that identity was inseparable from martial achievement. To live without honor was worse than death, a belief echoed constantly in the Iliad. Hector represents a different ideal. He fights for family, city, and duty rather than personal glory alone. His fear before battle, his love for his wife and child, and his sense of responsibility align with the role of a defender hero rather than a raider. This reflects the dual nature of Bronze Age warfare, which involved both aggressive expansion and defensive survival. Importantly, heroes in Homer are not perfect. They make mistakes, act selfishly, and suffer consequences. This realism suggests that the epics preserve social memory rather than fantasy. The heroes are models, but also warnings. Excessive pride leads to ruin. Refusal to compromise prolongs suffering. Archaeological evidence cannot name Achilles or Hector, but it confirms the world that produced such figures. Weapons buried with the dead, fortifications built at enormous cost, and evidence of repeated conflict all point to societies where warrior values dominated elite culture. Homer's heroes are not evidence of individuals, but of ideals. They show us what Bronze Age societies admired, feared, and remembered. In that sense, they are historical documents of belief. One of the most powerful aspects of the Iliad is its attention to family relationships. Fathers mourn sons, wives fear widowhood, and children face futures shaped by war. These themes are not decorative. They reflect the deep social consequences of conflict in small-scale societies. In Bronze Age cities, populations were limited. The loss of elite warriors could destabilize entire communities. Archaeology shows sudden breaks in occupation layers, abandoned houses, and shifts in burial practices after periods of conflict. These changes suggest not just military defeat, but social trauma. Homer captures this reality through personal scenes. Andromache's fear for Hector is not symbolic. It reflects the vulnerability of families dependent on a single protector. Priam's grief for Hector mirrors the collapse of Troy itself. These emotions would have been familiar to any society living under constant threat. Honor binds these relationships together. A warrior fights not only for himself, but for his household and ancestors. Dishonor affects entire lineages. This explains the intensity of Homeric conflicts, where insults provoke war and broken oaths demand vengeance. Archaeological evidence of feasting halls, ancestor worship, and lineage-based burial supports this worldview. War, in this context, is never abstract. It reshapes families, memories, and identities. The Trojan War endured in tradition because it represented the ultimate breakdown of social order. Cities fell, families were destroyed, and survivors were scattered. Such events do not fade quietly. By examining the social fabric behind Homer's story, archaeology and myth converge again. The Iliad preserves not just battles, but the human cost of war in a Bronze Age world. That cost is what made Troy unforgettable. No image from the Trojan War is more famous than the Trojan horse. A massive wooden structure, hidden soldiers, a city deceived by its own curiosity. For many people, this single episode defines the entire war. Yet when viewed through archaeology and historical logic, the Trojan horse quickly becomes problematic if taken literally. There is no archaeological evidence for a giant wooden horse, nor would we expect to find any. Wood decays, and symbolic objects rarely leave clear traces. More importantly, the idea of a massive structure being dragged into a fortified city stretches credibility when understood as a physical event. Bronze Age cities were cautious, suspicious places, especially after years of conflict. A besieged population would not casually accept an unknown object without debate, resistance, or control. However, myth does not operate on literal logic. The Trojan horse belongs to the language of symbolism. In ancient storytelling, deception often takes a concrete form to make the lesson memorable. The horse may represent betrayal, internal collapse, or misuse of ritual trust. It turns abstract strategy into visual drama. Some scholars have suggested that the horse symbolizes an earthquake. In Greek myth, Poseidon was both the god of horses and earthquakes. Since Troy 6 shows signs of seismic destruction, later storytellers may have personified this event as a horse sent by the gods. Over time, metaphor hardened into narrative. Others see the horse as a symbol of infiltration. Ancient warfare frequently relied on spies, traitors, or collaborators within the city. A hidden group opening the gates at night would be more realistic than a literal wooden structure. Oral tradition transformed this tactic into a single unforgettable image. Thus, the Trojan horse is best understood not as a historical artifact, but as a narrative device. It explains how a great city fell when force alone failed. It teaches that intelligence and deception can overcome strength. Archaeology cannot confirm the horse, but history does not require it to be real for the story to preserve truth. While the Trojan horse itself may be symbolic, deception in warfare was very real in the Bronze Age. Ancient armies lacked advanced siege technology, making fortified cities difficult to capture through direct assault. As a result, strategy often relied on manipulation, surprise, and psychological pressure. Hittite texts describe diplomatic deception, broken treaties, and false alliances. These were accepted tools of survival, even if publicly condemned. Archaeology shows that cities often fell not because their walls were breached, but because morale collapsed or internal order broke down. Famine, fear, and exhaustion could be as deadly as enemy weapons. Homer reflects this reality throughout the Iliad and Odyssey. Warriors used disguises, false retreats, and ambushes. Odysseus, the architect of the horse, is consistently portrayed as clever rather than physically dominant. His intelligence represents a different kind of heroism, one increasingly necessary in prolonged conflict. The Greeks' supposed retreat before the horse mirrors a known tactic. Feigned withdrawal could draw defenders out or lower their guard. Archaeological evidence from other ancient sites shows that sudden attacks often followed periods of apparent calm. War was as much about timing as force. Psychological warfare also mattered. Leaving a symbolic object at the gates could provoke debate, fear, or division within the city. In the Trojan story, the population is split between caution and hope. That division is what allows disaster to happen. Archaeology cannot recover arguments or emotions, but it confirms that cities under siege were socially strained. The Trojan horse, then, is not an invention without context. It exaggerates real practices into mythic form. It captures the idea that Troy did not fall simply because it was weaker, but because it was worn down, divided, and deceived. That is a historically plausible outcome of long-term conflict. Myth does not preserve facts the way archives do. It preserves meaning. The Trojan horse is a perfect example of how cultures encode complex experiences into simple stories. Rather than recording logistics, negotiations, and gradual collapse, myth compresses everything into a single moment of irreversible error. For generations who heard the story, the horse explained why Troy fell despite its strength. It warned against ignoring caution, disrespecting omens, and trusting appearances. These lessons mattered deeply in ancient societies where survival depended on reading signs correctly. Archaeology supports the idea of gradual breakdown rather than sudden conquest. Troy VA shows signs of prolonged stress before destruction. Houses were crowded, resources stored defensively, and the population likely lived in constant fear. Such conditions make internal failure more likely than dramatic assault. Oral tradition transforms this reality into a moral narrative. The city fell not just because of enemies, but because of a fatal decision. This gives the disaster purpose and clarity. It also shifts responsibility from chance to choice, making the story useful for future generations. Importantly, the Trojan horse appears mainly in later parts of the Trojan cycle, not the Iliad itself. This suggests that the story evolved over time, growing more symbolic as the historical memory faded. By the time it was widely told, the horse had become the definitive explanation for Troy's fall. In this way, myth and archaeology speak different languages about the same event. Archaeology shows collapse, destruction, and stress. Myth explains why those things mattered. The Trojan horse stands at the center of that explanation, not as a wooden object, but as a memory shaped into meaning. The fall of Troy did not happen in isolation. Archaeology makes one fact unmistakably clear. Troy's destruction occurred during a period of widespread crisis across the eastern Mediterranean. Around 1200 BCE, the entire Late Bronze Age system began to collapse. Cities burned, trade routes failed, palaces were abandoned, and populations moved or disappeared. Troy was one piece of a much larger historical breakdown. From Greece to Anatolia, from the Levant to Egypt, evidence points to simultaneous disruption. Mycenaean palaces fell. Hittite authority collapsed. Coastal cities were destroyed or abandoned. This was not a single war, but a systemic failure. Long-distance trade networks that supported bronze production broke down, removing the material foundation of military and political power. Troy Adia's destruction fits squarely into this pattern. The city shows signs of violent end, but also of long-term stress beforehand. Food storage suggests fear of siege. Overcrowded housing implies refugees or population pressure. These conditions were not unique to Troy. Similar evidence appears at sites across the region. This context changes how we interpret the Trojan War. Rather than imagining a single cause, we must consider multiple pressures acting at once. Conflict between Troy and Mycenaean Greeks may have been one factor, but famine, earthquakes, internal rebellion, and economic collapse likely played roles as well. The war remembered in myth may represent the human face of a broader disaster. Oral tradition, however, does not remember systems. It remembers stories. Troy became the symbol of collapse because it stood at the crossroads of cultures and trade. Its fall was dramatic, memorable, and emotionally charged. As other cities faded quietly, Troy's story endured. Thus, archaeology does not reduce the Trojan War. It expands it. It places Troy's fall within a moment when the ancient world itself was ending, making the story not just about one city, but about the close of an entire age point. One of the most debated elements of the Bronze Age collapse is the appearance of groups known as the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records describe waves of attackers arriving by land and sea, destroying cities and challenging imperial authority. Their exact identity remains uncertain, but they represent movement, instability, and pressure on existing systems. Some scholars have linked the Sea Peoples to displaced populations from the Aegean, including Mycenaean Greeks affected by internal collapse. If so, Troy's attackers may not have been a single organized army, but shifting coalitions driven by survival rather than conquest. Archaeology supports increased mobility and population movement during this period. This matters for how we imagine Troy's final days. Instead of a clean war between two stable powers, the city may have faced repeated threats from different directions. Trade partners became enemies. Allies vanished. Mercenaries and raiders replaced diplomats. In such a world, even a well-fortified city could fall. Homer's epic simplifies this chaos into two sides, Greeks and Trojans. This is not deception. It is narrative necessity. Human memory organizes complexity into opposition. Good and bad, us and them. The Sea Peoples disappear from myth because they lack identity within Greek cultural memory. Yet traces remain. The sense of endless fighting, wandering warriors, and returning heroes facing ruined homes reflects a world in motion. The Odyssey in particular captures this aftermath, where victory does not bring peace and survival replaces glory. Troy's destruction, then, may have involved forces larger than the city itself. It was caught in the movement of peoples, the breakdown of trade, and the failure of political order. Myth remembers the heroes. Archaeology remembers the collapse. Many cities fell during the Bronze Age collapse, yet only Troy became immortal. This raises a crucial question. Why Troy? Why not Mycenae, Hattusa, or Ugarit? The answer lies in geography, culture, and storytelling. Troy sat between worlds. It was close enough to Greece to matter to Greek memory, yet distant enough to feel exotic and symbolic. Its enemies could be cast as both familiar rivals and foreign others. This made Troy a perfect setting for epic. The city's fall also aligned with Greek cultural needs. As later Greek societies emerged from centuries of instability, they looked backward for identity. The Trojan War offered a shared past, a moment when Greeks acted together, even if imperfectly. It explained suffering, justified pride, and warned against excess. Archaeology shows that Troy was rebuilt after its destruction, but never regained its former importance. Memory, however, froze the city at the moment of its fall. This is how myth works. It preserves the moment that matters most, not what came after. The Bronze Age collapse erased many voices. Writing disappeared in Greece for centuries. Oral tradition became the primary carrier of memory. In that environment, a story as powerful as Troy's could survive, evolve, and eventually be written down. Troy became the story that explained an ending. The end of heroes, the end of great cities, the end of a world. Archaeology confirms that such an ending occurred. Myth gives it a face and a voice. In myth, the fall of Troy marks the end of war. In history, it marks the beginning of deeper uncertainty. Archaeology shows that the decades following Troy's destruction were not a time of triumph for the Greek world, but a period of fragmentation and decline. The Mycenaean kingdoms that supposedly won the war did not emerge stronger. Many collapsed entirely. Excavations across mainland Greece reveal burned palaces, abandoned administrative centers, and a sudden disappearance of writing. Linear B tablets stop abruptly. Centralized economies fell apart, and long-distance trade nearly vanished. This suggests that even if Mycenaean forces participated in Troy's destruction, the cost was enormous and the reward short-lived. Homer's epics reflect this indirectly. Greek heroes rarely return home peacefully. Agamemnon is murdered. Odysseus wanders for years. Others never return at all. These stories mirror a historical reality in which war destabilized societies rather than securing them. Victory did not restore order. It exposed weakness. From an archaeological perspective, this makes sense. The late Bronze Age system depended on interconnected palaces and trade networks. War disrupted those connections. When combined with famine, migration, and internal unrest, the system collapsed under its own weight. Troy's fall was not the climax of success, but part of a shared disaster. Thus, the aftermath of the Trojan War must be understood not as celebration, but as survival. Communities struggled to adapt without centralized authority. Memory preserved the war as a final heroic age, but archaeology reveals it as the threshold of collapse. The period following the Bronze Age collapse is often called the Greek Dark Age, roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE. The term does not mean ignorance or stagnation, but it does reflect a sharp reduction in material complexity and written records. Archaeology shows smaller settlements, simpler pottery, and fewer monumental structures. Writing disappeared entirely from Greece during this time. Without written archives, history survived only through oral tradition. This is critical for understanding how the Trojan War story evolved. Details faded, characters merged, timelines blurred. What remained were themes that mattered: honor, loss, loyalty, and the cost of war. The Dark Age was not empty. People continued to farm, trade locally, and build communities. Iron gradually replaced bronze, changing warfare and tools. New social structures emerged, less centralized and more flexible. These changes laid the foundation for later Greek city-states. During this period, stories became anchors of identity. The Trojan War offered a shared past that connected scattered communities. It explained why the world had changed and why heroes no longer walked the earth. The war marked the end of greatness and justified the hardships of the present. Archaeology confirms cultural continuity beneath apparent decline. Burial practices, religious symbols, and artistic motifs show gradual evolution rather than total collapse. This continuity allowed the Trojan story to survive, reshaped by each generation to fit new realities. Thus, the Greek Dark Age was not a void, but a crucible. It transformed history into myth and myth into cultural memory. Troy lived on because it helped people understand their world after it fell apart. By the 8th century BCE, Greece began to emerge from the Dark Age. Population increased, trade revived, and writing returned, adapted from the Phoenician alphabet. This moment was crucial for the Trojan War story. For the first time in centuries, oral tradition could be fixed in written form. Homer, whether an individual or a tradition, stands at this turning point. His epics do not record events as they happened. They preserve what survived in memory after generations of retelling. This explains why the Iliad focuses on a brief moment in the war rather than the entire conflict. It reflects how oral storytelling works, emphasizing emotional peaks over chronology. Archaeological evidence supports this layered memory. Homer describes a Bronze Age world using details preserved accurately, alongside elements from his own time. Iron weapons appear alongside bronze. Social customs blend eras. This mixture is not error, but inheritance. The decision to write the Trojan War story gave it permanence. Other collapse-era stories vanished, but Troy became fixed. Once written, it could be shared, taught, and referenced across the Greek world. It became a foundation of education, identity, and moral reflection. In this sense, the Trojan War is both historical and post-historical. It comes from real conflict, survives through oral tradition, and is shaped into epic long after the events themselves. Archaeology confirms the ruins. Homer gives them meaning. The aftermath of Troy was not just destruction. It was transformation. Out of collapse came memory, and out of memory came one of the most enduring stories in human history. By the time Greece entered the classical period, the Trojan War was no longer distant memory. It had become a cultural reference point, a shared story that Greeks used to think about themselves. Archaeology shows growing city-states, political experimentation, and public debate. In this changing world, Troy functioned as a mirror through which Greeks examined values like leadership, justice, pride, and responsibility. Classical Greeks did not read Homer as entertainment alone. The Iliad and Odyssey were educational texts. Young citizens learned them by heart. Philosophers quoted them. Politicians referenced them. Troy was treated as history in a moral sense, even if details were questioned. The war offered examples of both excellence and failure. Achilles embodied unmatched strength but destructive rage. Agamemnon represented authority weakened by arrogance. Hector showed duty and restraint, even as he fought on the losing side. Greeks did not see these figures as distant legends. They saw reflections of real political and social tensions in their own cities. Importantly, Troy allowed Greeks to criticize themselves indirectly. By placing excess pride, cruelty, and stubbornness in the past, they could debate present behavior without direct accusation. Tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides used Trojan themes to question the cost of war, the suffering of civilians, and the morality of victory. Archaeology supports this shift in perspective. Classical Athens, for example, invested heavily in public theater, civic education, and historical memory. Troy fit perfectly into this environment. It was a shared past flexible enough to serve different arguments. Thus, Troy became more than a destroyed city. It became a framework for thinking. Greeks used it to ask what kind of people they were becoming and what kind of people they feared becoming again. One of the most striking features of Greek treatment of Troy is respect for the enemy. Trojans are not portrayed as monsters or barbarians. They are brave, honorable, and deeply human. This is unusual for ancient war narratives and reveals something important about Greek identity. Homer presents Trojans as culturally similar to Greeks. They worship the same gods, follow similar customs, and value honor and family. Archaeology confirms that late Bronze Age Anatolia and the Aegean shared many cultural traits. This closeness made Troy a rival, not an alien threat. In classical Greece, this portrayal served a purpose. By respecting Troy, Greeks could explore the tragedy of war rather than just its glory. Plays like the Trojan Women focus on the suffering of defeated civilians, especially women and children. These works were performed in societies that actively engaged in warfare, forcing audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. This empathy was not accidental. Classical Greeks were deeply aware of how easily fortune could reverse. City-states rose and fell. Alliances shifted. Troy reminded them that greatness did not guarantee survival. Archaeology shows increasing commemoration of the past during this period. Monuments, inscriptions, and public rituals emphasized memory. Troy became a symbol of the thin line between victory and ruin. By honoring the Trojans, Greeks acknowledged shared humanity across conflict. This does not mean they rejected war, but they recognized its cost. Troy helped them articulate that recognition in story rather than theory. As Greek thought became more analytical, thinkers began questioning the literal truth of Homer's stories. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides approached Troy with caution. They did not dismiss it, but they reframed it. Herodotus treated the Trojan War as part of a long cycle of conflict between East and West. He accepted that something happened at Troy, but he emphasized causes like retaliation, misunderstanding, and escalation rather than divine intervention. This approach aligns with archaeology, which shows repeated conflict rather than singular catastrophe. Thucydides went further. He stripped the war of gods and focused on power, resources, and human ambition. He argued that Homer exaggerated the scale of the conflict, but not its existence. For Thucydides, Troy represented early large-scale warfare driven by economic and strategic concerns. This intellectual shift matters. It shows Greeks moving closer to historical thinking while still preserving myth. Troy became a testing ground for new methods of understanding the past. Archaeology, though unknown to them, would later confirm many of these instincts. Philosophers also used Troy to debate ethics. Was Achilles justified? Was obedience to authority more important than personal honor? These questions were not abstract. They shaped political thought in democratic and oligarchic states alike. By the classical period, Troy existed simultaneously as myth, moral lesson, and historical event. This layered identity kept it alive. It could change without disappearing. Troy endured because it adapted. Each generation found new meaning in its ruins, long before archaeology uncovered them again. When Rome rose to power, it inherited the cultural memory of Greece, including the story of Troy. But Rome did something unusual with that inheritance. Instead of identifying with the Greek victors, Romans chose to identify with the defeated Trojans. This choice was not accidental. It served Rome's political needs and reshaped the meaning of the Trojan War. Roman writers traced their origins to Aeneas, a Trojan hero who escaped the city's destruction and journeyed west to Italy. This story, preserved most famously in Virgil's Aeneid, transformed Troy from a symbol of defeat into a symbol of endurance. Troy did not truly fall, according to Roman memory. It migrated and was reborn as Rome. This narrative allowed Rome to claim ancient legitimacy. By linking themselves to Troy, Romans placed their origins deeper in time than Greek city-states. They were not late imitators of Greek culture. They were heirs to a more ancient, tragic, and noble past. Archaeology supports Rome's desire for deep roots, even if not the literal journey of Aeneas. Excavations in Italy show long-term settlement, cultural blending, and migration myths common across the Mediterranean. Roman origin stories fit a wider pattern of societies using myth to explain complex beginnings. By adopting Troy as ancestor, Rome reversed the moral framing of the war. Greeks became aggressors. Trojans became victims whose survival justified future greatness. This reframing allowed Rome to absorb Greek culture while asserting moral independence. Thus, Troy gained a new identity. No longer just a lesson in hubris or tragedy. It became the foundation of imperial destiny. Virgil's Aeneid was not written as neutral literature. It was a political epic composed during the reign of Augustus. Its purpose was to provide Rome with a unified origin story that supported imperial authority. Troy played a central role in that project. In the Aeneid, Troy's fall is brutal and heartbreaking. The suffering of civilians is emphasized. The city burns not because it deserved to fall, but because fate demanded transformation. Aeneas is not portrayed as a conqueror, but as a survivor carrying tradition, gods, and family into the future. This portrayal aligns closely with archaeological reality. Cities destroyed in the Bronze Age collapse often did not vanish completely. People fled, resettled, and rebuilt elsewhere. Memory traveled with them. Virgil's Troy reflects this pattern, turning archaeological displacement into poetic destiny. The epic also reframes heroism. Aeneas is not driven by rage like Achilles. He is driven by duty. He sacrifices personal desire for collective future. This model suited Roman imperial ideology, which emphasized order, obedience, and continuity. Augustus himself claimed descent from Aeneas. Troy thus became embedded in Roman political legitimacy. Monuments, coins, and rituals reinforced this connection. Archaeology in Rome shows deliberate engagement with Trojan imagery during the early empire. Through the Aeneid, Troy ceased to be merely a story of the past. It became a justification for the present. Roman power was framed not as conquest, but as fulfillment of destiny begun in ashes. Under Roman rule, Troy's meaning expanded beyond Greek or Trojan identity. It became a universal story of destruction followed by renewal. This broader appeal helped the myth endure across cultures and centuries. Romans governed a vast empire made up of conquered peoples. Many of those populations had experienced defeat, displacement, and cultural loss. Troy offered a narrative that validated suffering without glorifying weakness. Loss did not erase worth. Survival could lead to greatness. Archaeology across the Roman world reveals widespread rebuilding over earlier ruins. Cities were layered, not replaced. Roman audiences understood Troy not as a unique tragedy, but as a familiar pattern. Destruction followed by adaptation. This interpretation softened the brutality of empire. If Rome itself came from refugees, then conquest could be framed as historical necessity rather than cruelty. Troy's fall became the first chapter of a long imperial story rather than an unresolved wound. At the same time, Troy retained its emotional power. Roman poets, historians, and artists continued to portray its fall with sorrow and respect. The enemy was honored. This preserved the complexity of the myth and prevented it from becoming simple propaganda. Thus, Troy survived Rome not as rubble, but as meaning. It crossed cultural boundaries and adapted to new political realities. Archaeology gives us the ruins. Roman memory gave them purpose. Troy endured because it could explain both loss and ambition, grief and empire. Few stories achieve that balance. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe entered a period where classical knowledge survived unevenly. Greek texts were largely lost in Western Europe, while Latin summaries and adaptations remained. Troy, however, did not disappear. Instead, it was reshaped to fit medieval values, politics, and worldview. Medieval audiences did not read Homer directly. They encountered Troy through Latin retellings and later medieval romances. These versions stripped away much of the ancient context and reframed the story as a tale of chivalry, betrayal, and courtly honor. Achilles became a knight-like figure. Hector was praised as the ideal noble warrior. The gods faded into the background, replaced by moral judgment. This transformation tells us more about medieval society than about Bronze Age Troy. Europe at the time was organized around feudal loyalty, dynastic legitimacy, and Christian ethics. Troy was adapted to reflect those concerns. The war became a lesson in pride, treachery, and the dangers of moral corruption. Archaeology was not part of medieval thinking. Ruins were seen as symbols rather than evidence. Troy existed primarily as a moral story explaining why great cities fall. The idea that Troy had once been real was rarely questioned, but proof was unnecessary. Authority came from tradition, not excavation. Interestingly, medieval Europeans often traced their own origins to Troy, following Roman precedent. British, French, and other royal genealogies claimed Trojan ancestry. This pattern shows how Troy continued to function as a tool of legitimacy. To be descended from Troy was to claim ancient, heroic roots. Thus, in the medieval world, Troy survived as a flexible myth. It adapted to new moral frameworks and political needs, keeping its power even as historical understanding faded. The Renaissance marked a turning point in how Troy was understood. Scholars began recovering Greek texts, including Homer, and reading them alongside Roman authors. This return to original sources changed the tone of the Trojan story once again. Humanists treated Troy not just as moral allegory, but as part of ancient history. They compared texts, debated contradictions, and questioned medieval distortions. While archaeology was still in its infancy, the idea that physical evidence mattered began to take hold. Artists and writers portrayed Troy with renewed attention to antiquity. Architecture, armor, and customs were imagined as ancient rather than medieval. This visual shift reflected a growing desire to understand the past on its own terms. At the same time, Troy remained politically useful. Renaissance rulers continued to claim Trojan ancestry, blending scholarship with ambition. The myth's authority had not weakened. It had simply gained intellectual polish. Importantly, Renaissance thinkers began to ask whether the Trojan War really happened. Some argued that it was exaggerated. Others defended its historicity using ancient sources. This debate laid the groundwork for later archaeological inquiry. The Renaissance did not solve the mystery of Troy, but it reopened the question. By valuing evidence, comparison, and historical context, it prepared the intellectual soil for modern archaeology. By the early modern period, skepticism toward ancient myths increased. Scientific thinking, exploration, and new methods of historical analysis encouraged doubt. Troy was no longer automatically accepted as fact. It became a problem to be solved. Historians began separating myth from history more sharply. Some dismissed the Trojan War as poetic fiction. Others argued that myth could preserve distorted truth. This tension remains central to Troy studies today. Archaeology still had not provided answers. Travelers searched for Troy's location but lacked systematic methods. Many proposed sites, often guided by ancient texts rather than material evidence. Without excavation, debates remained theoretical. Yet something important had changed. Troy was no longer just a story to inherit. It was a question to investigate. This shift transformed the meaning of the myth. It invited future scholars to look beneath the surface, literally and figuratively. Early modern skepticism did not destroy Troy's legacy. It strengthened it by making it intellectually challenging. The myth endured because it resisted simple answers. By the time modern archaeology emerged in the 19th century, Troy was ready to be rediscovered not as legend alone, but as a historical puzzle embedded in real soil. Before modern archaeology existed as a disciplined field, Troy was a place imagined more than examined. Travelers, scholars, and antiquarians visited northwestern Anatolia for centuries, guided by ancient texts rather than evidence in the ground. They debated locations, compared landscapes to Homeric descriptions, and relied heavily on intuition and literary authority. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, the search for Troy reflected broader intellectual trends. Classical education emphasized texts, not material culture. Homer was read as a literary master, and geography was interpreted symbolically. Ruins were admired, but systematic excavation was rare. Digging was often destructive, aimed at collecting impressive objects rather than understanding context. Several proposed locations competed for Troy's identity. Some scholars favored areas closer to the coast. Others focused on plains that matched Homer's descriptions of battle. Hizarlik, the mound that would later become famous, was known but not universally accepted. It lacked obvious monumental ruins on the surface, making it easy to dismiss. What mattered more than accuracy was authority. Scholars with strong reputations could promote theories without physical proof. This environment delayed Troy's rediscovery, but it also preserved the site from premature destruction. Importantly, this period established a tension that still shapes archaeology today. Should ancient texts guide excavation, or should material evidence challenge literary tradition? Troy would become the testing ground for that question. When archaeology finally turned toward Troy seriously, it would do so with both ambition and error. The rediscovery of Troy did not happen gently. It arrived through obsession, confidence, and controversy. Heinrich Schliemann's arrival marked a turning point not just for Troy, but for archaeology itself. Unlike cautious scholars, Schliemann believed Homer described real events and real places. He was convinced that Troy existed exactly as Homer described it, and he was determined to prove it. Schliemann began excavations at Hizarlik in the 1870s. His approach was aggressive. He cut deep trenches through the mound, removing entire layers of settlement in his rush to reach what he believed was Homeric Troy. From a modern perspective, his methods were disastrous. He destroyed invaluable evidence and misinterpreted what he found. Yet the impact of his work was revolutionary. Schliemann uncovered multiple layers of occupation, demonstrating that Hizarlik was not a random mound but a site of long-term settlement. This alone forced scholars to reconsider Troy's reality. Myth had left physical traces. Schliemann's most famous discovery, so-called Priam's treasure, captured public imagination. Though later proven to predate the Trojan War, it convinced the world that Troy had been wealthy and important. The idea that Homer's city might be real could no longer be dismissed. Academic reaction was mixed. Scholars criticized Schliemann's methods and conclusions, but they could not ignore his results. Archaeology had entered classical studies in a way it never had before. Schliemann was not a careful scientist, but he was a catalyst. He changed the rules of debate. Troy was no longer just a literary question. It was an archaeological one. After Schliemann, archaeology at Troy began to mature. Later scholars recognized both the value and the damage of his work. They approached the site with greater caution, focusing on stratigraphy, chronology, and context rather than spectacle. Excavators like Wilhelm Dorpfeld and Carl Blegen refined the understanding of Troy's layers. They identified Troy 6 and 7 as the most likely candidates for Homeric Troy. Their work transformed Troy from a single imagined city into a complex urban history spanning millennia. This shift mirrored changes across archaeology as a discipline. Excavation became systematic. Layers mattered. Small artifacts gained importance alongside monumental finds. Interpretation became cautious rather than confident. Troy thus played a central role in shaping modern archaeology. It demonstrated the dangers of letting myth dominate evidence, but also the dangers of ignoring myth entirely. The site showed that ancient stories could preserve memory, but only archaeology could test it. By the early 20th century, Troy was firmly established as a real place with a long history. The question had evolved. Scholars no longer asked whether Troy existed. They asked how myth, memory, and material evidence interacted to produce one of the world's most enduring stories. The rediscovery of Troy did not end debate. It made debate possible on new terms. That, more than any treasure, was its greatest contribution. By the mid-20th century, archaeology had changed dramatically, and Troy became one of the clearest examples of this transformation. Excavation was no longer about confirming ancient texts or uncovering spectacular objects. It was about understanding how people lived, adapted, and responded to change over time. At Troy, this meant re-examining earlier conclusions with better methods and fewer assumptions. Carl Blegen's work in the 1930s marked an important step. Unlike Schliemann, Blegen treated Troy as a layered historical record rather than a single legendary city. He carefully documented architectural phases, destruction layers, and everyday objects. His conclusions, especially about Troy 6 and VA, shaped scholarly debate for decades. Later excavations, especially those led by Manfred Korfmann beginning in the late 20th century, expanded Troy beyond its citadel. Using modern survey techniques, archaeologists identified a large lower city surrounding the fortified core. This discovery changed the scale of Troy dramatically. It was no longer a small hilltop fortress. It was a substantial urban center with a population large enough to support regional importance. This mattered because earlier skepticism often focused on Troy's size. Critics argued that Homer's Troy was too grand to match the ruins. The lower city changed that argument. It showed that Troy had economic depth, defensive planning, and social complexity consistent with a major Bronze Age city. Archaeology at Troy had matured into a careful dialogue between evidence and interpretation. Each layer was no longer a confirmation or rejection of Homer, but part of a long human story. This shift marked Troy's full entry into modern historical inquiry. Modern archaeology brought tools that earlier generations could not imagine. Ground-penetrating radar, geomagnetic surveys, satellite imagery, and environmental analysis allowed archaeologists to study Troy without destroying it. These methods revealed roads, ditches, and settlement patterns invisible to the naked eye. One major discovery was a defensive ditch surrounding the lower city, suggesting organized urban planning and concern for protection. This supports the idea that Troy faced real threats and invested heavily in defense. Such infrastructure aligns with the possibility of prolonged conflict rather than sudden collapse. Environmental studies also reshaped understanding of Troy's location. Changes in coastline, river systems, and sedimentation showed that Troy's relationship to the sea had shifted over time. What once seemed inland may have been closer to navigable waters in the Bronze Age. This strengthened Troy's strategic importance as a trading hub. These findings reminded scholars that landscapes change, but texts do not. Homer's descriptions, once dismissed as inaccurate, made more sense when ancient geography was reconstructed scientifically. Archaeology did not prove Homer right. It showed that the world he described had changed beneath modern feet. Technology also reduced reliance on dramatic conclusions. Instead of asking whether Troy was destroyed by Greeks, archaeologists examined how people adapted to stress, rebuilt after disaster, and reorganized society. The focus shifted from heroic endings to human resilience. This broader perspective placed Troy firmly within regional history rather than isolated legend. It became a case study in how cities survive, fail, and transform over centuries. Modern archaeology did not settle the Trojan War debate. It made it more complex. Some scholars emphasize evidence of conflict and destruction around 1200 BCE. Others stress continuity, rebuilding, and regional collapse rather than single wars. Troy, once again, resists simple answers. Debate now centers less on whether Homer was right and more on how memory works. How does a real city become an epic symbol? How does violence become story? Archaeology shows us the material traces of stress, fear, and recovery. Myth shows us how people understood those experiences. Importantly, Troy's studies now include voices beyond classical scholarship. Anthropologists, environmental scientists, and historians of memory all contribute. This interdisciplinary approach reflects how archaeology itself has evolved. Troy's future lies not in proving or disproving Homer, but in understanding why Troy mattered so much that it was never forgotten. Few cities destroyed in the Bronze Age achieved this status. Troy did because it stood at a crossroads of trade, culture, and imagination. As excavation continues and technology advances, interpretations will change again. That is not failure. It is the strength of historical inquiry. Troy remains alive because it continues to challenge assumptions. In the end, modern archaeology has not reduced Troy to ruins. It has restored Troy as a human place, shaped by geography, politics, fear, and hope. That complexity is what keeps the story relevant. Archaeology is powerful, but it has limits. It can uncover walls, weapons, burn layers, and abandon houses. It can date destruction, trace trade, and reconstruct daily life. What it cannot do is confirm motives, speeches, or personal relationships. This distinction is essential when weighing archaeology against myth in the case of Troy. At Hizarlik, archaeology confirms that a major city existed, that it was wealthy, fortified, and strategically located, and that it suffered destruction during the Late Bronze Age. These facts alone validate the core assumption behind the Trojan War tradition. Troy was real, and it fell during a time of widespread conflict. However, archaeology cannot tell us who attacked Troy, how long fighting lasted, or whether a single war caused its destruction. Burned layers do not name enemies. Arrowheads do not record allegiances. Even mass graves, when present, reveal violence but not narrative. This is where disappointment often arises. People want archaeology to confirm Homer scene by scene, but that expectation misunderstands both archaeology and epic poetry. Archaeology deals in probability and pattern, not dramatic certainty. What it does show is consistency. The world described by Homer aligns broadly with what archaeology reveals about Bronze Age society. Warfare methods, social hierarchy, material culture, and regional instability all match. That alignment matters. Thus, archaeology does not prove the Trojan War as a literal 10-year siege led by named heroes. It proves that the story rests on a real historical foundation. The bones are there, even if the flesh is poetic. Myth begins where evidence falls silent. This is not a weakness. It is a human response to uncertainty, trauma, and loss. When societies experience events too complex or painful to record precisely, they turn them into stories that carry meaning instead of data. The destruction of Troy likely involved multiple causes: conflict, earthquake, famine, political collapse, and migration may all have played roles. Such complexity does not survive well in memory. Oral tradition simplifies. It assigns blame, creates heroes, and offers closure. Homer's epics do exactly that. They transform a prolonged period of instability into a focused narrative with clear actors and moral tension. Achilles embodies rage. Hector embodies duty. The gods explain randomness. The Trojan horse explains failure without humiliation. This process is not unique to Troy. Archaeology shows similar patterns elsewhere. Cities fall, people scatter, and stories emerge to explain why. Over generations, those stories become cultural truth, even as factual detail fades. Importantly, myth does not erase history. It preserves emotional reality. The grief of loss, the pride of resistance, and the fear of collapse survive in narrative long after names and dates are forgotten. In Troy's case, myth allowed the city to live on when its physical presence declined. Without Homer, Troy would likely be one of many ruined Bronze Age sites. With Homer, it became unforgettable. Thus, myth does not compete with archaeology. It complements it. Each tells a different part of the same human story. The greatest mistake in Troy studies is forcing archaeology and myth to agree completely. Their value lies in tension, not harmony. Archaeology challenges exaggeration. Myth challenges reductionism. Together, they prevent oversimplification. When archaeologists reject Homer entirely, they risk ignoring the power of memory. When readers accept Homer literally, they ignore material reality. Balanced interpretation requires accepting uncertainty. Modern Troy studies increasingly embrace this approach. Scholars ask how memory forms, how trauma is remembered, and why certain events become epic while others vanish. Troy is not just a historical question. It is a case study in how humans remember. This perspective does not diminish Troy's importance. It enhances it. Troy matters not because we can prove every detail, but because it shows how history becomes identity. Archaeology grounds the story in place and time. Myth gives it voice. Neither is complete alone. Where history ends, story begins. And where story endures, history finds new questions to ask. Troy exists in that space, not as a solved problem, but as an ongoing conversation between earth and imagination. That is why Troy still matters. In a modern era, Troy moved beyond classrooms and scholarly debate into mass culture. Novels, films, television, and popular history books transformed the Trojan War into a global story recognized far beyond academic circles. This transition reshaped how people understand Troy, often emphasizing drama and personality over complexity and uncertainty. Modern retellings tend to focus on individual characters. Achilles becomes the central figure, portrayed as either a tragic hero or a dangerous force. Hector is often shown as the moral heart of the story. Helen is framed as victim, cause, or symbol, depending on the creator's intent. These interpretations reflect modern concerns about power, responsibility, and identity more than Bronze Age reality. Film adaptations, especially, simplify the narrative. Long-term conflict becomes a short campaign. Political and economic causes disappear in favor of personal motivations. Gods are removed or minimized to appeal to modern audiences uncomfortable with divine intervention. Archaeology rarely appears explicitly, even though it underpins much of what we know. Yet popular culture also keeps Troy alive. Each retelling invites new audiences to engage with the story, even if indirectly. Many people first encounter Troy through fiction before turning to history. In that sense, popular culture plays a role similar to oral tradition. It reshapes the story while preserving its emotional core. The danger lies in replacement. When dramatized versions become the only versions people know, nuance is lost. Troy becomes a fixed narrative rather than a historical problem. This is where education becomes essential, offering tools to question and expand what popular culture presents. In education, Troy occupies a unique position. It appears in literature courses, history classes, archaeology programs, and even philosophy seminars. Few ancient topics cross disciplines so easily. This makes Troy both valuable and challenging to teach. In literature, the focus is often on Homer's language, character development, and themes. Students analyze honor, fate, and human emotion. In history and archaeology, the emphasis shifts to evidence, chronology, and interpretation. The same story is examined through different lenses, sometimes leading to confusion, but often encouraging critical thinking. Modern educators increasingly emphasize comparison. Students are asked to place Homer alongside archaeological findings, Hittite texts, and modern scholarship. This approach reflects current academic consensus that Troy cannot be understood through a single source. Archaeology plays a crucial role here. Images of Troy's walls, maps of Hizarlik, and reconstructions of Bronze Age life ground abstract stories in physical reality. Students learn that history is built from fragments, not finished narratives. Teaching Troy also opens discussions about how history is written. Why do some stories survive while others vanish? Who controls memory? How do power and culture shape what is remembered? Troy becomes a gateway to understanding historical method itself. In this sense, Troy is not just a topic. It is a training ground for historical thinking. It teaches students to live with uncertainty, weigh evidence, and respect multiple interpretations. Troy remains relevant because it speaks to experiences that do not fade with time. War, displacement, pride, and loss are not ancient problems. They are ongoing realities. Modern audiences recognize themselves in Troy's story, even when details differ. The fall of Troy resonates in a world shaped by conflict and migration. Refugees carrying memory, cities destroyed and rebuilt, and the struggle to explain catastrophe are all deeply familiar. Archaeology shows that these patterns existed thousands of years ago. Myth gives them language. Troy also challenges modern assumptions about progress. A sophisticated world collapsed, not because it lacked intelligence or culture, but because systems failed under pressure. This lesson remains uncomfortable and important. In popular culture, Troy often reflects contemporary anxieties. Some retellings emphasize the futility of war. Others focus on leadership failure or moral compromise. Each generation finds its own questions in the story. Academically, Troy continues to inspire research, debate, and discovery. New technologies, new theories, and new perspectives ensure that the story remains open rather than settled. Troy survives because it adapts. It can be epic, evidence, warning, or mirror. That flexibility has kept it alive for nearly 3,000 years. When scholars today ask whether the Trojan War really happened, they're no longer asking a simple yes or no question. The debate has matured. The real issue is what kind of event lies behind the myth. Archaeology, comparative texts, and regional history now allow a more grounded answer than ever before. The strongest case for a historical conflict rests on convergence. Troy existed. It was large, wealthy, and strategically located. It was destroyed during the late Bronze Age, at a time when conflict across the Eastern Mediterranean was widespread. Hittite records refer to Walusa, likely Troy, and describe disputes involving Mycenaean Greeks. These are independent sources pointing in the same direction. Archaeology shows signs of violence in Troy VIA, including fire, weapons, and unburied bodies. The city appears to have been under stress before its destruction, suggesting prolonged threat rather than sudden accident. Defensive preparations indicate fear of attack. This fits the idea of repeated campaigns or raids rather than a single dramatic siege. From a historical perspective, this is enough to argue that a real conflict occurred. It may not have involved all of Greece, nor lasted 10 years continuously, nor centered on a single cause like Helen. But it likely involved Mycenaean forces attacking or pressuring Troy over trade, influence, or political alignment. In ancient history, this level of evidence is significant. Many accepted historical events rest on far less. The Trojan War, stripped of poetry, emerges as plausible regional warfare remembered and magnified over time. Thus, most modern scholars agree on a cautious conclusion. Something happened at Troy that mattered deeply to those who experienced it. That event was violent, disruptive, and memorable enough to survive centuries of oral transmission. Despite strong evidence, archaeology cannot deliver absolute proof. There is no inscription saying, "Here the Greeks destroyed Troy." There is no named battlefield with identifiable armies. This frustrates those seeking definitive answers, but it reflects the reality of ancient history. Archaeology works with fragments. Cities burn for many reasons. Weapons can be defensive or offensive. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is presence proof of intent. Interpreting destruction requires caution. Some scholars argue that Troy's fall fits better within regional collapse than targeted war. They emphasize earthquakes, internal strife, and economic breakdown. From this view, the Trojan War is a narrative overlay applied to a complex disaster. This perspective is not unreasonable. Archaeology shows continuity as well as collapse. Troy was rebuilt. Life went on. Not every destruction layer represents conquest. However, rejecting war entirely ignores patterns of violence and historical context. The late Bronze Age was not peaceful. Written records confirm conflict, rebellion, and foreign intervention across the region. Troy's strategic position made it unlikely to escape these pressures. The honest conclusion lies between extremes. Archaeology cannot confirm Homer's war in detail, but it strongly supports the idea of armed conflict involving Troy and external powers. Certainty ends there. This uncertainty is not failure. It is the boundary between evidence and interpretation. Accepting that boundary is part of responsible historical thinking. Asking whether the Trojan War really happened is not just about ancient history. It is about how humans understand the past. Troy forces us to confront how memory, evidence, and identity interact. If we demand perfect proof, we erase much of ancient history. If we accept myth uncritically, we abandon analysis. Troy sits between those extremes, reminding us that the past is neither fully recoverable nor entirely imagined. The Trojan War matters because it shows how real events become meaningful stories. Archaeology reveals what happened to places. Myth reveals what happened to people's sense of themselves. For the Greeks, Troy explained the end of a heroic age. For the Romans, it justified empire. For medieval Europe, it offered moral lessons. For modern scholars, it tests methods and assumptions. Each generation asks the question again because the answer changes with perspective. That does not weaken the story. It strengthens it. The Trojan War may never be fully proven or disproven, but its endurance is itself evidence. Only events that matter deeply survive that long, even transformed. In the end, the most accurate answer is this: The Trojan War, as told by Homer, did not happen exactly as described. But a war at Troy, violent enough to scar memory, almost certainly did. That tension between fact and meaning is where history lives. To understand Troy fully, we must move beyond the question of what happened and ask how it was remembered. History records events. Memory reshapes them. Troy belongs more to the second category, and that is not a flaw. It is the reason the story survived when countless other events vanished. Collective memory does not aim for accuracy. It aims for meaning. Societies remember what helps them explain the present, justify identity, or warn about danger. The Trojan War survived because it did all three. It explained why a glorious past ended, justified later struggles, and warned about pride, division, and unchecked ambition. Archaeology confirms that the late Bronze Age collapse was traumatic. Cities burned, trade ended, writing disappeared. For people living through, or just after this collapse, the world must have felt broken beyond repair. Troy became a symbol of that break. It represented the last stand of an old order. Oral tradition preserved this memory by focusing on emotion rather than detail. Grief, rage, loyalty, and loss mattered more than dates or troop numbers. That is why characters feel so vivid. They carry emotional truth even when factual certainty fades. Memory also simplifies. Complex systems collapse for many reasons, but memory prefers stories with cause and consequence. Helen becomes a symbol. The gods become explanations. The horse becomes the moment everything went wrong. This process is not unique to Troy. Archaeology shows similar myth-making around other collapses and disasters. What makes Troy special is scale and survival. Its memory crossed languages, empires, and centuries. Seen this way, Troy is not a failed historical record. It is a successful act of remembering. Many cities fell during the Bronze Age collapse. Most are known only to specialists. Troy is known to the world. This difference demands explanation. Geography played a role. Troy sat at a crossroads between regions, cultures, and trade networks. Its fall affected many groups. That alone increased the number of people who carried its memory forward. Narrative also mattered. Troy's story contained clear oppositions, attackers and defenders, home and exile, victory and loss. These oppositions made the story adaptable. Greeks could tell it one way, Romans could tell it another. Medieval Europeans could reshape it again. Archaeology shows that Troy was rebuilt but never regained its former status. This made its destruction final enough to symbolize an ending. Cities that recover quickly do not become myths. They become footnotes. Timing mattered as well. Troy fell just before writing disappeared in Greece. That meant the story entered oral tradition at the moment when oral tradition became dominant. It had centuries to evolve before being fixed in text. When Homer finally wrote the epic tradition down, Troy had already become larger than history. It was no longer just a place. It was a reference point for loss, courage, and consequence. Other cities lacked this combination of location, narrative clarity, and cultural timing. Troy had all three. Thus, memory chose Troy not because it was unique in destruction, but because it was uniquely useful as a story. Troy's power today lies in its ability to connect distant past with present concerns. Archaeology grounds it in reality. Myth keeps it relevant. Modern audiences still respond to Troy because it raises questions that do not expire. What is the cost of honor? When does pride become destruction? How do societies explain catastrophe? These questions matter now as much as they did 3,000 years ago. Archaeology reminds us that advanced societies can fail. Troy was fortified, wealthy, and connected. None of that saved it. This lesson unsettles modern assumptions about progress and security. Myth, meanwhile, gives us language for loss. Statistics and ruins cannot express grief. Stories can. Troy's endurance proves that humans need narrative to process trauma. In this sense, Troy is not just about the past. It is about how humans carry the past forward. Each retelling is an act of interpretation. Each excavation is an act of questioning. Troy stands where evidence and imagination meet. Remove either, and the story collapses. Together, they create depth. As we approach the end of this series, one thing becomes clear. Troy matters not because it can be fully proven, but because it cannot be forgotten. One of the most important lessons Troy teaches us is that history is not something we recover intact. It is something we reconstruct from fragments. Walls, ashes, weapons, and text do not speak on their own. They require interpretation, comparison, and restraint. Troy forces historians to confront this reality more clearly than almost any other ancient site. Archaeology at Troy does not give us a complete story. It gives us layers of human activity interrupted by destruction and renewal. Each layer answers some questions while creating new ones. This is uncomfortable for those who want history to function like a courtroom verdict, delivering certainty. Troy refuses that role. Instead, Troy shows that historical knowledge is probabilistic. We weigh evidence. We consider context. We accept that multiple explanations can coexist. A city can be destroyed by war and weakened by earthquake. A memory can preserve truth and distortion at the same time. This approach is not weakness. It is intellectual honesty. The alternative is forcing evidence to fit expectation, something Schliemann famously did. Modern archaeology learned from that mistake. Troy helped teach the discipline to slow down, document carefully, and resist grand conclusions unsupported by data. Troy also reveals how much history depends on absence. The lack of written records from the Greek side during the collapse forces reliance on material culture and foreign archives. That absence shaped how the story survived. Silence became space for myth. Understanding Troy means accepting that history is not a photograph of the past. It is a mosaic built from broken pieces. Some gaps remain forever. Troy teaches us to work within those gaps rather than pretend they do not exist. Troy also exposes the responsibility of historians. Because evidence is incomplete, interpretation carries weight. Scholars influence how societies understand the past. With Troy, that influence has been visible for centuries. When Troy was treated as pure myth, archaeology was dismissed. When it was treated as literal history, evidence was abused. Both extremes distorted understanding. The modern approach emerged only when scholars accepted uncertainty as a feature rather than a flaw. This has broader implications. Many historical debates suffer from the same problem. People want simple answers. History rarely provides them. Troy reminds us that confidence must be proportional to evidence. The historian's role is not to resolve every question, but to clarify what can be known, what is likely, and what remains speculation. Troy teaches restraint. It teaches humility. It also teaches the danger of using history to serve identity without critique. Greeks, Romans, medieval kings, and modern nations have all used Troy to justify power, ancestry, or ideology. Archaeology exposes how easily stories are reshaped for purpose. By studying Troy critically, we learn to recognize that pattern elsewhere. History becomes not just knowledge of the past, but defense against misuse of the past. In this sense, Troy is not only an ancient case study. It is a modern warning. Troy deserves its central place in historical study not because it is unique, but because it is representative. It shows how cities rise and fall, how memory preserves meaning when records vanish, how evidence and story interact. Few sites force historians to combine archaeology, literature, linguistics, anthropology, and memory studies so completely. Troy cannot be understood through a single discipline. That makes it difficult, but also valuable. Studying Troy trains historians to think across boundaries, to question sources without dismissing them, to respect myth without surrendering to it, to accept complexity without paralysis. This is why Troy continues to appear in classrooms and scholarship. It teaches method as much as content. It shows how knowledge is built, challenged, and revised. Ultimately, Troy teaches that history is not about closing debate. It is about understanding why debate exists. The ruins at Hizarlik do not give final answers. They give responsibility. Responsibility to interpret carefully. Responsibility to separate evidence from desire. Responsibility to acknowledge uncertainty honestly. That is what Troy teaches us about history itself. After archaeology, texts, debate, and centuries of reinterpretation, some conclusions about Troy are firm. Troy was not an invention. It was a real city, located at Hizarlik in modern Turkey, occupied for thousands of years, and deeply embedded in the political and economic world of the late Bronze Age. This alone marks a major victory for historical inquiry. We know Troy was strategically positioned near vital trade routes. We know it was fortified, wealthy, and culturally connected to both Anatolia and the Aegean. We know it experienced destruction during a period of widespread instability around 1200 BCE. These facts are supported independently by archaeology, environmental studies, and Near Eastern written records. We also know that Mycenaean Greeks were active across the Aegean and Western Anatolia at this time. Hittite texts confirm contact, rivalry, and conflict involving a city very likely to be Troy. Archaeology confirms violence and stress at the site during the correct period. From a historian's perspective, this is substantial evidence. It supports the conclusion that a conflict involving Troy and external forces, likely including Mycenaean Greeks, did occur. It may have involved raids, sieges, or repeated campaigns rather than a single dramatic event. It may have been smaller in scale than Homer describes, but it was real enough to leave scars in the ground and memory in the region. Thus, the Trojan War cannot be dismissed as pure fiction. At the same time, it cannot be accepted as literal epic history. The truth lies between those extremes, grounded in evidence but shaped by storytelling. Just as important as what we know is what we cannot know. Archaeology will never tell us whether Helen existed, whether Achilles fought at Troy, or whether a single commander led a united Greek army. Names, speeches, motivations, and timelines remain beyond recovery. We cannot reconstruct the war as a narrative sequence with confidence. We do not know how long conflict lasted, how many times Troy was attacked, or whether its fall was caused primarily by war, earthquake, or internal collapse. Even the idea of a siege may be a later simplification of complex events. This uncertainty frustrates modern expectations. We want closure. We want answers. Troy refuses to give them, and that refusal is not a weakness of evidence, but a reflection of ancient reality. Bronze Age societies did not document events for future historians. They lived them, survived them, and remembered them imperfectly. What survived was not data, but meaning. The Trojan War endured because it answered emotional questions rather than factual ones. Why did the old world end? Why did suffering happen? Why did greatness fall? Archaeology cannot answer those questions alone. Neither can myth. Together, they show why certainty is not the goal of historical understanding. Some questions about Troy will always remain open. accepting that as part of respecting the past rather than forcing it into modern expectations. The siege of Troy endures because it sits at the center of human experience. It is about conflict driven by pride, fear, ambition, and loyalty. It is about cities destroyed and rebuilt, people displaced, and memories carried forward when institutions fail. Archaeology reminds us that advanced societies are fragile. Troy had walls, trade, and power. None of it guaranteed survival. That lesson remains relevant in every era. Myth reminds us that humans need stories to process loss. Fact alone do not heal trauma. Stories give shape to pain and meaning to endurance. Troy became immortal not because it was the greatest war, but because it became the most meaningful one. The dialogue between archaeology and myth makes Troy more important, not less. It shows how history is built from evidence and imagination working together, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony. Troy matters because it teaches humility. It warns against certainty without evidence and belief without question. It shows that the past is not something we conquer, but something we approach carefully. In the end, the siege of Troy is not just a question about ancient war. It is a lesson in how humans remember, interpret, and learn from catastrophe. That is why Troy still stands, not only in ruins at Hizarlik, but in classrooms, books, debates, and imagination. And that is why it will continue to endure. Today, you didn't just hear the story of the Trojan War. You learned what archaeology can prove, what myth explains, and why both are necessary to understand the past. You saw how a real city existed, how it stood strong at the center of ancient trade, and how it fell during a time when the entire Bronze Age world was collapsing. You learned that the Trojan War was not a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a memory shaped by trauma, survival, and generations of storytelling. The moral of Troy is not about victory. It is about fragility. Even the strongest walls can fall. Even the most advanced civilizations can collapse. And when they do, what survives is not power, but memory. That is why Troy endured. Not because every detail was true, but because the story carried meaning. Meaning about pride, loss, courage, and the cost of war. If you enjoyed this deep historical journey, remember that history does not end here. Every ruin has a story. Every myth hides a truth. And every age leaves lessons for the future. This is History Teller YT, where the past speaks and we listen. Stay curious, stay questioning, and we'll meet again in the next story from history.